I work in the CapEd Credit Union, which does not have a branch here in Middleton, so I can speak freely, although they wouldn't appreciate it. They kind of like when I keep quiet and do my job, but I'm not really good at that. Anyway, you have a bank, or you used to have a bank here in Middleton called the Middleton National Bank, right? You heard of it? Actually, if you look out the window, you can't see it. No, because the police station's in the way, but if it wasn't, just pretend the police station wasn't there, you could see the bank, the original building. And the point of all this is that back in 1926, most of us, probably none of us was born. And so the Mitchell brothers, well, they left their beards behind and they came up from Utah. And it was Artie and Walter Mitchell. And Artie turned to Walter and he said, "Hey, here we are in Middleton. What do you want to do?" And Walter said, "Well, did you bring up your gun?" "Yeah." "Well, how about we rob the bank?" And so they grabbed their guns and they went to the bank and they tied up the banker and the cashier, right? And they made off with $1,600. And to this day, nobody knows what happened to the $1,600, right? Well, like I said, they tied up the banker and the cashier, and they made off with the $1,600, and they ran off. Now, Artie and Walter, they were no Boy Scouts, okay? All they knew how to do was slip knots. So the hostages got free, and they went chasing the brothers, along with one of their customers who had a Hudson Super 6, which sounds really fast, but keep in mind, this is 1926. The fastest they could go is 18 miles an hour. And so they're chasing the brothers down Main Street. And somehow, that was Mr. Peasley in his Hudson Super 6 chasing the boys. And he got distracted, and he kept going straight while the Mitchell brothers took a left turn quick down Whiffle Street. And Mr. Peasley, he just kept going. He probably ended up in Ontario. But he finally figured it out, and so he got a hold of the sheriff, and the sheriff was making hay somewhere, and so Mr. Peasley got him and said, "Okay, hey, you got to put a posse together." So that's what the sheriff did. Meanwhile, the Mitchell brothers, they go down Whiffle Street, and guess what? It's a dead end, straight into a wire fence. So now what are we going to do, Walter? Well, we got to ditch the car. So the boys, they ditched the car and they hopped the fence. They ran out into the field. Now, if you know anything about fields, if you're a bank robber, a field is not a good place to hide. But this was no ordinary field. No, there was a tree and some bushes. And so the Mitchell brothers said, "Hey, why don't we hide in the tree? And we'll wait until things cool off, and then we'll take the money and we run." Well, what they weren't planning on is that the sheriff and the posse caught up with them. So now you got the Mitchell brothers, they're hiding in the bushes behind the tree, and the posse and the sheriff, they show up. And you can imagine the posse's pretty excited. You know, they got their revolvers out, and they're like, "Well, let's shoot them. And the sheriff's like, no. If there's going to be any shooting, it's going to be me." Well, the sheriff scratched his head, and he said, "Mitchell brothers, come out with your hands up." And so Artie and Walter, they look at each other, and they're like, "No, I don't think so." And so a few minutes pass by, and Walter shouts, "No!" Well, there's a lot of commotion with the posse. You know, they're still trying to, they're playing with their revolvers, and they're making a big ruckus. And the sheriff said, "Shh! Did any of you hear what the Mitchell brothers said?" "No." All right, well, keep it down. And so sheriff yells out again, come out with your hands up. And then this time the posse, they kept it down, and Walter yells out, no. So now what? So now you got a classic Middleton standoff. And so the sheriff thinks about it. He says, oh, I know what I'm going to do. Hey, boys, watch this. And he pulls out his revolver. Bam! Up into the trees above the Mitchell boys' heads. Right? It's getting serious. This is like probably the biggest day in the history of Middleton. Nothing like this had ever happened before or since. Well, the Mitchell brothers looked at each other and said, I don't want to get shot. And so they said, well, okay, why don't we surrender? And so they came out with their hands up, and the sheriff arrested them and hauled them off to jail. Now, that's not the end of that story. No, because in jail, either Walter or Artie, one of them died of TB. I mean, sad, right? And so I have a theory about what happened to the $1,600. I think the TB was a pre-existing condition. And so the money went to the American Lung Association for TB research. Too little, too late. So he died. Yeah, Walter's gone. Meanwhile, Artie gets out of jail in 32. And he hightails it back to Utah, to spend the rest of his days with his relatives. Because down in Utah, everything's relatives.